so excited. I know, it just fires me up. Woo! Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome again to Great Lane Christian Church Fairbanks. It's great to see all of you guys this morning. Glad to see especially some folks visiting from Anchorage and from all over the place, actually. So it's really cool. Thank you guys for coming and encouraging the church here this weekend. Thank you guys all who braved the kind of chilly, windy weather yesterday, a little bit of rain, to come on out and barbecue with us to kind of celebrate the fall coming in. And thank you for braving that cold and still making it fun and goofy and ridiculous in a good way. I had a good time. Hopefully all of you guys did as well. And just grateful for that. I guess Oliver did not have as good a time. Like, I'm offended that he was talking about that. But anyway, this morning we are going to continue the journey and the trek that we've been going through, which is the book of 1 Corinthians. So this morning we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And so that's what we've been doing for the last several weeks. If you've been with us, you would remember all the stuff that we've been going through in 1 Corinthians. It's been a really good time. But as we jump into 1 Corinthians 7 this morning, I want you to just ask a question of yourself. The question that I have for you is, if you had the opportunity to ask an apostle a question, or if you had the opportunity to ask an apostle a bunch of questions, what would you ask? And what would you ask to someone who was taught directly by Jesus himself? What would you ask someone that had that direct inspiration from Christ? You know, and it's just an interesting question to ask, because as we jump into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, you're going to notice the first words of the chapter start with, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So this kind of signals a shift in the book of 1 Corinthians. So up until this point, Paul was addressing a bunch of specific issues that he saw, some problems in the church and some issues that they were facing, but now he's shifting into this response, really, of questions or things that the Corinthian church had written to Paul about. And they had some questions for him. So now they're asking these questions, and we're trying to figure out, we're kind of playing a game of Jeopardy here, because we get the answers, and then we're trying to kind of back it up and figure out what the questions originally were. So in order to understand the responses that Paul gives in this chapter and the chapters following, we kind of have to remember the context, right? We have to remember the context of 1 Corinthians and remember that these questions were asked in a very specific context based on very specific issues that the church was facing. So with that in mind, unsurprisingly, you might find that the questions that the church in Corinth was asking Paul are probably not the questions that you came up with right now as you were thinking about what you would ask an apostle. But as always, though the original questions or though the points that we're specifically talking about might not resonate with you at first, I think that there's a lot of broad application for our lives, again, even if the initial thing doesn't seem to quite resonate. So instead of going through all of the book of 1 Corinthians 7 and kind of like nailing all these different things, I've given you a nutshell response, right? 1 Corinthians 7, in a nutshell, help you understand a little bit of what the Corinthians were asking. So these are some of the questions that we can kind of infer were being asked of Paul based on his responses. So I'm just kind of going to go through these really quick. So one of the first questions, should I abstain from sexual relationships or relations with my spouse? That's kind of verses 1 through 7. The answer, no, you should not. And is it right to get married at all? Or is it good to get married at all? Well, that's covered in verse 8 to 9. And Paul's response basically is, it really depends, but you can see it throughout this chapter. He has a very strong preference for singleness. He likes a single life, and that's okay. But doesn't restrict people to it, saying you shouldn't get married, or it's wrong to get married, anything like that. He doesn't say anything like that. But he does have that preference. Another question that would have come up here, what about divorce? Right? That's covered in verses 10 and 11. Basically, the response for Christians, don't do it. Right? Don't get divorced. It's not something that you should do. And then a final question that kind of came through here was, should I divorce my unbelieving spouse? That's addressed in verses 12 through 16. And the answer, again, probably not, because you have an opportunity to help your unbelieving spouse find Jesus. So this seems kind of like a random smattering of questions. Again, probably not the questions that you were thinking when you were thinking about what you'd ask Paul or one of the apostles. But remember that the city of Corinth was a highly immoral city. It was known for its shrine prostitution. It was known for just its wild style of living in general because of the pagan temples. And so because of sexual immorality was so rampant in the city, and because it had seeped so much into the church, many Christians were thinking that maybe they should just avoid sexual relations altogether by never being married. Even some of the married Christians were like, well, maybe I would be more spiritual if even I, in my marriage, still abstained from that kind of physical part of my relationship with my spouse. And other Christians began to think that they were married, and they're like, well, maybe I should be single. And then single Christians were like, maybe I should never get married at all. And then other married Christians were thinking, well, maybe it would be more spiritual for me if I divorced my unbelieving spouse and then found a disciple and got married to that person, and then everything would be better. Right? So there's a lot going on in here. And you can see that why there's a lot of these confusions, and you can see why they've been writing this letter to Paul. They're like, help us out, we're really confused. And Paul's great. He doesn't do a whole lot of, you got to do this and it needs to look like this, but he gives a really good, gentle response that I think is really applicable to all of us, regardless of whether you're concerned about your singleness or your marriage or whatever. But I think this response applies to us in a lot of different ways. So let's read it. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. Chapter 7, 17. There you go. It says, nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to the faith in the Lord is the Lord's free person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. So the Corinthians were basically, in many senses, they were trying to think of how they could kind of go into a different status or a different phase of life. And if only they were in that different phase of life or that status, then they would be more spiritual. Then they would be more faithful. Then they would be more effective. And basically Paul responds to all of this by saying, listen, there's a whole lot of options here. There's a whole lot of different scenarios that can play out, and you might choose one thing, and you can choose, or you might choose the other thing, and you might still be righteous, right? We're not talking about going from darkness to light or sin to good here. We're just talking about different options within the realm of righteousness. But rather than thinking all about how spiritual you could be if you change your stage of life, why not just be spiritual and faithful now? In the stage of life that you're in right now, that you're already in. Why don't you just remain there and serve God from where you're at? Right? See, often the Corinthians here and us today, we struggle with this notion, this mentality of the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Right? We're always waiting for the next thing, and we're always thinking like, well, if it were only a little bit different than it is now, then I would be able to do more. Then I would be able to be really spiritual and really effective for God. Right? We say things like, oh man, if only I had a different job, then I would have more time to spend with the church. Or, oh, if only I had less homework, then I would be able to spend more time in the Bible. Right? Oh, if only I was less busy, then I would be able to serve more. Right? And the list goes on and on and on. But eventually what happens is that all of that thinking of if only becomes an excuse for why we're not spiritual and faithful and effective right now. But what Paul is saying is just be okay with where you're at now and be effective and spiritual and faithful for God now. Right? If only I were married, then I would be more effective. If only I was single again, then I would be effective. You're not like, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. Just be effective where you're at. Go after, pursue God from where you're at. And I get it, right? I do this all the time in my own life, right? When Natalie was pregnant, I was trying to take care of her to make sure she was okay, and I thought in my mind like, oh man, I'm gonna go to the grocery store when Oliver's born, and I'm gonna reach out like a champion, because who doesn't like talking to a guy in the grocery store with a baby, right? And I was like, this is gonna be great, it's gonna be so much fun, people are gonna talk to me, and it's not gonna be weird, and I'm gonna invite lots of people to church, right? And then Oliver was born, I take him to the grocery store, and nobody talks to me. Right? Like, well, what the heck? How come nobody's talking to me? I can't reach out to anybody. And then I would go by a park, and I'd see a bunch of older kids playing on their park equipment, right? And I'd see their parents watching and say, oh, that's what it is. When Oliver's a little bit older, and then he can play on the equipment at the park, then I'll be able to reach out to all of these people, right? But what's really the solution? No, it's just I just need to reach out. I just need to do it now. I need to stop waiting for the next thing, and I just need to make the decision to do it now, not waiting for the next stage to make it happen, right? So I get that different seasons of life afford us different resources and amounts of time to do stuff, but our focus needs to be on how we can use those resources that we've been given now to serve God. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, I think, highlights this very well. It says, for he says, in the time of my favor I heard you. In the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. The time to start focusing and figuring out how you can be effective for God and serve Him is not next time, is not the next phase. The time is right now. So what about you? In your current stage of life, with the resources that you have, how can you serve God now? How can you be effective for Him now? Not whatever the next phase is, not whenever your status or your stage of life is going to be different, but now. Because here's the reality. Regardless of what stage of life you're in, regardless of what your status is, right, you have the resources to serve God today. You have a gift, you have talent, you have skills that God has given you to make an impact for Him today. It's just a matter of you making the decision to do it. So just imagine for a second, if we were not only content, but excited and fired up about where we're at in our lives today. And imagine if we just focus on the present moment, and focus on the resources that we have right now, and learn to channel those resources to serve God now, instead of just thinking if only this, or if only that. So let's take stock. Let's take stock of what God has given us right now and make the decision to live for Him, to serve Him, to be faithful to Him, and to be effective for Him today. Amen? All right.